This was a project that I worked on as a consultant for the City of Calgary, and we handed in our final report the morning of the flood, which was actually very good timing, but also very bad timing. In this room today, we've already seen this definition, I think, 4 times, so I'm not going to read it out. But basically, this is the Alberta Water Council definition for riparian areas. I've underlined 2 things here that I really want to draw attention to. Variable width, so fixed width buffer setbacks are not going to work to capture the appropriate extent of riparian areas. And also, they have an influence on associated water bodies, alluvial aquifers, and floodplains. So I underlined floodplains because riparian areas really coincide spatially with floodplains for the most part. So there's different definitions, different schools of thought. Floodplains defined by civil engineering, riparian areas are defined by biology and ecology. But really, most of the time, they're in the same physical spatial locations. When we're talking about floodplain management, we're talking about riparian management, or we're talking about riparian management, we're talking about floodplain management. The boundaries may not be exact, but they really, really overlap physically. So I already mentioned we completed this for the City of Calgary in 2012 and 2013, or I guess for myself. I completed it for myself in 2012 and 2013. The steering committee we had, Water Resources, was leading that project, but we also had representatives from Parks, City of Calgary Parks, City of Calgary Land Use Planning and Policy, as well as Infrastructure and Information Services. And the primary objectives of this project was to create a strategic catalyst that will support riparian land management, conservation, and restoration, to provide a vision of that over long term. And also to support, complement, and inform a range of plans, policies, and processes, including watershed planning, urban planning, regulatory processes, river engineering, and the riparian strategy, which was developed by the city, sort of concurrent by how much slope is being added up as you're moving away from the river. This is an accepted method to do this. We drew from various other researchers that have done similar things in the United States. Once that GIS cost surface is created, though, you need to decide what are the thresholds, because that's just a continuous surface. What are the thresholds that actually are the riparian boundaries? So how do you know where those riparian boundaries are? When you're doing floodplain analysis, you're using the flood frequency analysis. In this case, as we're mapping riparian edges, we use field data to basically calibrate where those riparian edges are. So we had field sampling of where the riparian vegetation edges are in the field, in open spaces, so not in developed areas where there's a road or something else which has erased the signature that was there before, but taking GPS points of those riparian vegetation edges in the field. We also supplemented that by another GPS data source from the cows and fish riparian polygon edges, also collected in the field. And we did a separate analysis for each stream and river because we didn't want to pool all the data together. So for each river, we did separate statistics. And so those statistics, based on the field data, helped to define the locations of, we used kind of a 4-zone approach. So the inner riparian zone, which is virtually certain to be riparian, and that's the blue that you see in that little map on the side. The middle riparian zone, which has areas with very strong potential for riparian conditions. Obviously, there's a lot of variability when you're looking at these things in the field, so it may not always be, but most of the time it is. Outer riparian zone, in many circumstances, they are riparian if the conditions are right, and then we had an outermost riparian zone. These are typically not riparian, but they can be statistical outliers that, in some cases, they will be. These are just some basic. I'll just flash through these really quickly here. So the blue is that inner riparian, going out to the yellow edge, which is the potential outermost. So this is West Nose Creek overlaid on an air photo in northwest Calgary. Radio Tower Creek in the southwest Calgary. And I think that's coming through quite nicely. So this is showing the Elbow River in Elbow Park to Mission area. And as you can see, it kind of, if you've been looking at the floodplain maps of the Elbow and other presentations over the last few days, you can see there's a very, very similar pattern here when you look at that outer dark yellow boundary. Those are basically the areas that flooded in 2013. It really has a strong relationship to where those floodplains are. The advantage of doing the statistics that we did is that the riparian areas are being mapped for both developed riparian areas as well as existing open space riparian areas. And then as part of this Theme 1 map, we also put on other data sets to complement the variable width mapping, so the riparian health from cows and fish work, which is what you may have heard about earlier this afternoon, as well as the bank health from the AMEC and cows and fish study. Just another kind of snapshot. This is Discovery Ridge, Griffith Woods area on the edge of southwest Calgary, along the elbow. And then I just threw up some kind of summary statistics of the riparian extent. So again, we saw really high variability, and this is sort of showing the second quartile to fourth quartile range of where those riparian edges are. So for the bow, it's very, very large, 145 meters to 350 meters. The Elbow River, about 100 to 280 meters. Nose Creek, a little bit smaller, and you can see some other examples of streams and creeks that we looked at. So the second model that we looked at, we did was looking at what the Environmental Reserve setback rules basically say. Well, they're guidelines, but what those actually say, and converting that into a GIS map and model, and then showing that on maps. So basically, this setback has, depending on the stream order, there's a base setback, and then there's adjustment factors based on slope as you're moving away from that. There's also supposed to be ER taken for any alluvial aquifer that has been very difficult to implement. So the methods applied, so in GIS we just basically took the base setback distance based on the stream order. We did a raster slope analysis, and then we just divided each side of the shoreline into segments, created polygons, calculated average slopes, and then added the slope modifiers. So and we did this citywide, regardless of whether it was a greenfield community where this would be applying for new developments or old ones, just to look for lost, areas that are already developed, just to look for lost opportunities from potentially not having had this in the past. This is just one of the outputs from Memorial Pro-Child Trail area. So the second theme of these 57 maps citywide was land and regulatory issues. So on there we show the floodway and flood fringe in the land use bylaw, so that's the cross-hatching. And then we looked at major land use types like major infrastructure in red, residential communities in yellow, so on and so forth, and open space usually in green. The yellow dotted line is that ER setback policy, which has been mapped. And then we had different ways of rolling up these statistics into, okay, well, where are the developed riparian areas? What are the key land uses? And you can hone into different areas, like Nose Creek has a lot of that industrial development. Elbow River obviously has no industrial development, but a lot of residential development. But just grouping them together, so we have these categories: commercial, industrial, residential, institutional, transportation and utility corridor, or other major infrastructure like railroads. Deerfoot Trail, I think, fell into that category. And then mixed use, very small component. All of those are considered developed riparian areas. And then the undeveloped riparian areas consist of two components. So that's existing designated parks and recreation areas. And then also the future urban development category. That's just the category used by the city land use planners. It's basically the agricultural lands on the margins of Calgary. This is basically just a simpler graphic showing that currently, of all the rivers and streams we looked at in Calgary, just under 30% of riparian areas have been developed, and in fact about 70% is undeveloped. And then we created some broader kind of simpler maps that depicted where those lost developed riparian areas are and where those remaining riparian areas are. So in purple here you see the lost riparian areas, and in green are the remaining riparian areas. So again, thinking back to how riparian areas coincide with floodplains, everything you see in purple here was on the national news in June 2013. We made this map far in advance of that, and all the areas in green were not on the national news because they're resilient, they're adapted to floods, and there's no damage. So infrastructure maps, I won't talk about this too much because I want to get to the next point, but we just basically mapped out where the bank infrastructure is, where the storm falls are, buildings, roads, parks, facilities, and turf, and things like that. So then we moved into riparian opportunities. So how do we kind of map what the future might look like and how we may want to manage riparian areas going into the future? So we engaged stakeholders in defining policy opportunities and gaps, and we wanted to also provide that overall spatial vision and guiding document for riparian planning and management. And then we also defined and allocated management categories and suggested recommendations for each one of those. And potentially these could have different kind of targets or management intent. And we defined 5 categories and then used that as a basis for mapping that. So we also did a survey, an internet survey. We had about 23 responses, and those were used to help refine our approach and materials. We created a web mapping tool that allowed people to interactively explore that data and click things on and off and pan around or snap to different communities. And then in last February of last year, we organized a workshop which was multidisciplinary, multi-departmental. We had really good turnout, about 45 people attended. So we had a lot of really good representation from water resources, parks, roads, land use planning, development and building approvals within the City of Calgary. We also had representation from other groups that were invited. So in that we sort of did a democracy exercise, identifying conservation priorities, identifying restoration priorities on big posters, defining and determining what management categories we should be using, what are the prohibited, discretionary, and permitted uses for each of those categories. And another interesting thing that we did is we mapped spatially basically where there may be policy gaps in the existing riparian protection within land use planning processes in the city. So in green here we show the base environmental reserve setback with the slope adjustment modifier. So this is showing southeast Calgary from sort of Cranston and north of there to the edge of the city along Rocky View County. You can see Pine Creek coming in there, and then the Bow River kind of dominates this map. So the green is that base environmental reserve setback policy. The yellow is where the alluvial aquifers are most likely to be based on the geology. So basically any coarse sediments right next to the river based on moraine. And that we were basically calling, and it was confirmed by a lot of city officials involved in actual area structure plans and subdivision applications, that is an implementation gap where it's very difficult to take most of that as ER. And then we also showed the remaining riparian areas that would not be covered under that ER setback policy. So those are the things that come out in red. And some of the biggest gaps of that were along Forest Lawn Creek, but you can see small gaps where there's large riparian areas that aren't covered by any of these policies or processes. But of course the big gap is the orange. Orange is what you see the most of. So the 5 categories we defined were conservation, restoration, recreation, flood and erosion control, and then developed riparian areas. And we went through a GIS overlay procedure and model to kind of format and crunch different feature data layers that would represent opportunities for each of those classes. And we formatted that. It was about 47 data layers formatted and used in total. So for each of those potential zones, we had feature classes within there. And the idea was to minimize opportunities and maximize including features that were associated with conservation or restoration. So we used that using MarkSan, which is it's a computer tool originally developed out of Australia, I think over 20 years ago. But basically it's an optimization tool for land use planning solutions. It looks for solutions in a multi-dimensional space to try to minimize opportunity costs between competing objectives. So a colleague of mine uses this analogy of probes being sent onto Mars. If you send one probe, it might find a local minima, but really by sending lots of probes, you'll be able to find the lowest spot on Mars and not be trapped into these local lows that may not be the best solution. So conservation, we define that as riparian areas retained for natural open space establishment or maintenance. We use 16 data feature layers. I'm not going to go through them all here, but there's a few examples thrown up on the screen there. And in total, we had about 63% of all riparian areas in the city allocated to that conservation zone. And you could break that down by different creeks. There's different trends in different creeks. Restoration zones, so those were defined as riparian areas with suboptimal health or suboptimal vegetative cover that will be reclaimed, revegetated, or restored in the short to medium term. So we used 10 data feature layers for that. We built on the cows and fish work, the AMEC triple bottom line priority restoration sites. We looked at things like potential future stormwater retrofit areas, the idea being that when you put those projects in, there's also an opportunity to include within those projects some riparian restoration. And the February 25th workshop restoration priorities. So spatially, about 3% of all riparian areas in the city were allocated to this restoration class, and then we also further segmented those into 4 priority categories. Of course, as I said, we submitted this the morning of the flood, so they had to add some additional sites to that after the flood. Flood and erosion control. Riparian areas subject to flood and erosion risk. The priority is to mitigate potential flood or erosion damage using the best options available to maximize riparian function while managing flood and erosion control issues. So the idea is, even in the flood and erosion control zones, large riprap is going to obviously be a big component, but it doesn't exclude bioengineering approaches either. So feature data layers we use for that were basically infrastructure that's protected by bank integrity. So where you already have existing infrastructure perpendicular to the bank, houses, roads, other infrastructure. If it's protected by that inner bank, then that's when it would get a much higher priority than somewhere else. Outfall structures, existing bank infrastructure there already, pipeline crossing locations, those are some of the key ones. And we get only about 1% of all the riparian area allocated to this zone, because typically it's a very narrow area right along the bank, so it doesn't add up to a lot of area. And then the final one, developed riparian areas affected by current development, but if suitable opportunities arise, so for example redevelopment, closure of a major industrial facility, reclamation of gravel pits is a big one, these areas will be assessed for restoration. And for that we use things like impervious surfaces, buildings, roads, and we get just under 20% allocated to that category. So these are the results, these are the maps showing that. So recreation is shown in yellow, restoration in red, conservation in green. The purple, which at this scale you can't see too many of them, but there are a few along the Elbow River there. And then the gray is the developed. So these, just a few more maps, I'll just flash them quickly so we have time for questions. So recommended applications in city programs and plans. We have the City of Calgary Riparian Strategy and the Implementation Plan, which will be taking that forward. That document is already publicly available, the Riparian Strategy. I'm already hearing that some people are trying to apply these in area structure plans. I would like to see them looked at in any area redevelopment plans. Parks is aware of this information, and we're going to be trying to have as much of this information used as possible in biophysical impact assessments, parks and recreation planning and management, and of course in river engineering and bioengineering projects, which is Frank Frigo's group at the city. So just quickly, some of the recommended practices for conservation zone: avoid structural hard engineering approaches, minimize new outfalls. For parks, prioritize these areas for future open space establishment, prohibit high intensity recreation. All BIAs should identify and if necessary, refine the riparian boundaries. Land use planning and policy leverage financial incentives, land swaps, regulatory instruments. Transportation, avoid new crossing structures. Restoration zones, we have kind of different recommendations, so prioritize these for bioengineering projects. Integrate stormwater retrofit projects with riparian restoration. Parks, limit public access if areas are undergoing restoration. Land use planning, facilitate or lead a process of converting gravel pit restoration zones to open space, and also integrate restoration within large-scale redevelopment initiatives, so for example, West Village. So we did a post-flooding assessment, post-flooding reconnaissance with Cows and Fish in July 2013, because of course the first question after handing this in was, is any of this still valid now that all the riparian areas have changed? And so we did 3 days of field reconnaissance, and what we found is most of the restoration zones we identified, they showed severe bank erosion and damage, whereas the conservation zones, which are generally natural open spaces with intact, healthy riparian areas, those typically remained intact. They were resilient to these, so it's a very simple message. When there's healthy, intact, well-vegetated riparian areas, it's resilient to flooding. When those things are not present, it is not resilient to flooding. So Mayor Nenshi talked about resilience. That's, I think, the simplest message we can provide. Of course, there are post-flood landscape changes, so we have maps showing here's the bank and here's the riparian areas. Some of those do not exist anymore, especially where you have 16 years of bank laws. It doesn't change the purpose or intent of this mapping exercise. You still, but because of that, we say that we need site evaluations to really interpret that citywide mapping. You wouldn't want to use it for determining where the bank is in some of these areas that have experienced erosion. So the Riparian strategy will be taking this forward into developing indicators and targets and an implementation plan. There are 4 kind of overarching goals of the city's Riparian strategy. So that's protecting riparian health, connecting Calgarians, recognizing values of riparian areas, and aligning activities. So when we talk about aligning activities, that's with federal, provincial, regional strategies, regional planning, and a variety of municipal policy strategies and municipal plans. So I think I'll tie it up there. And this last slide I threw up, the top 2 photos are actually at the south bank of the Bow River in downtown Calgary. These were basically they were dumping grounds and slums for several decades. At one point in time, there was supposed to be a major freeway and a railway that would be located along the river. As most of you know, that's a highly used open space with a regional pathway system. It's a really strong amenity, really good interface with downtown. So that was planning, and that took some vision and strategy to make sure that happened. And it also included citizen involvement. So present and then future. So how all this pans out, it really depends on what different departments at the city do, what developers do, what citizens do, what people in this room do, ideas that you would take forward, and we don't know what kind of before and after pictures we may be able to show in 20 years from now. So, thank you.